join us. And I guess we can start, and I'll just try to keep my eye on the waiting room too. So thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm happy to be here with my colleagues, Michelle McGaw and Lauren Carson, and I'm Terri Cortvriend. I think most of you I've already met on Zoom before, at least. And we're happy to have John Marion with us this evening. And we're going to talk about redistricting. And I am recording so that we can put this up on YouTube afterwards. So John will talk and he will explain, he'll go through, give us a 101 on redistricting. And then he'll talk about one of the bills that I sponsored. And then we'll take questions, and it'll just be informal and conversational. So thank you for joining us. And with that, I will be honored to turn this, unless Lauren or Michelle, do you have things you want to say this evening before we get started?
Well, I just want to welcome John and say thank you for being here and providing the information. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank Judy Jones, who's on this Zoom meeting, because this was her idea. I was just telling them before we got on that you asked about redistricting. And so Terry and I thought we would make it happen, and Michelle joined us. So thank you. And thank you, John, for giving us some time this evening.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And so John, we'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay. My one request, can you make me a co-host so that I can share?
I hope so.
Yep. So the three little dots in my square, in Hollywood Squares, just click on the three little dots and it should say.
Make host?
Yeah, you can make me host.
Okay. You're the.
Or co-host. It's up to you.
That's one of the options?
Yeah, co-host is better.
Okay. Let's see.
I think if you make me host, it'll download on my computer when we're done.
Oh, we don't want to do that. I don't have the co-host.
Okay.
Be the host.
If it's host, that's fine. And I can.
Okay, you're the host.
So
I don't think I have the co-host option.
okay. And if I get the download, we'll make arrangements. So
okay.
But yeah, no, thank you for having me to your triple constituent meeting. Is that what we call it? Like constituent palooza. And thank you everybody for taking time out of your Sunday night. I'm John Marion. I run the Good Government Group, Common Cause, Rhode Island, which is if you're not familiar with us, we're a 51-year-old organization, both nationally and locally, that works on open government and voting rights and separation of powers and a whole host of other issues. And we work on redistricting. And so I was asked to come talk a little bit about redistricting in Rhode Island, which is I'm going to try to do without getting too deep in the weeds. But if you want to get deep in the weeds in the Q&A, we can get as deep as you'd like. So let me see. I'm going to try to share my screen. Ta-da. Okay. PowerPoint. I will not kill you with PowerPoint tonight. We're not going to do the whole PowerPoint. We'll just do part of it. Did that work for everybody? Okay. So I'm not going to go through all these goals. This is for a longer presentation that I actually have on YouTube. So if you want the whole hour version, I can send you the link. But I want to talk sort of about the basic concepts. This is one of those topics where there's like a particular vocabulary that has specific meaning. And so I want to talk just about a couple of the ideas there. And then the other thing I wanted to get to is then how do we do these things in our particular state, the ocean state. I'm not going to go deep on the types of gerrymandering and so forth, but that's a rough outline of where we're going to go here. So I will explain this in a second, but so redistricting is really about two things. So everybody saw the headline on Monday, Rhode Island keeps its second congressional seat. It was big surprise, nice victory for the state. We found 43,000 people we didn't know we had. And what Monday was something called reapportionment. So the census was actually created in 1789 with our Constitution, and it was created for a single purpose, which was to reapportion the seats in the US House of Representatives. And had we gone to one seat in the US House of Representatives, as it was expected, it would have been the first time since 1789. So actually the very first Congress in 1799, Rhode Island had one seat. In 1790, after Thomas Jefferson, as Secretary of State, had run the first census, we got 2 seats. And we have had 2 or 3 seats ever since, from the 1910 census until the 1930 census, we had 3 seats. And this is done by taking each state's total population. And that's what we found out on Monday, was the state's total population of a little under 1.1 million people, and putting it into a formula with the other 49 states' total populations. I'm not going to read the formula. There is a square root involved. It's beyond my mathematical abilities, but it ranks every seat, and it then tells you like what is the last state to have its additional seat, and what is the first state to not gain an additional seat. We thought that we would be out, that we were going to lose a seat. But actually, we were the 8th from the bottom, so we weren't even close. New York lost its additional seat, keeping an additional seat by 89 people. Minnesota kept its additional seat by 26 people, right? So super tight margins there. So reapportionment is giving out those seats. And the next reapportionment that will happen is our General Assembly is going to have to sort of apportion the population of the state among the 38 state Senate districts and the 75 state House districts. And given that our population increased by 43,000 people, and there were probably shifts in the geography, we're going to have to rebalance the population in the state. And that's because starting in the 1960s, the US Supreme Court said that districts have to meet the one person, one vote standard. And that was what they call the reapportionment revolution. It was a series of cases culminating in one called Baker versus Carr. And congressional districts have to be really close, plus or minus 1%. State legislative districts don't have to be plus or minus 1%. It's a little higher according to the courts, but they have to be pretty close. In all practicality, they actually, when they do this reapportionment, they will get those districts within almost a single human being. That has to happen every 10 years after those census numbers come out. We know the districts have to have equal population. Everything else we refer to as redistricting. That is where we draw the boundaries and we decide which people to include in those districts, right? So we can include all sorts of people in say the 75 House districts, for example, right? We could, try to, include as many people from Newport into a single district as possible. Or we could split Newport up, and have a bunch of reps or senators represent Newport. And so redistricting is where it gets challenging. It's easy to count. It's easy to say we have to have, equal number of people in each district. It's hard to draw those boundaries, particularly in states that are diverse, like Rhode Island, and states that have tricky geography, like Rhode Island. This is not a hard exercise in the state of Iowa, right? Their districts are squares, and they're mostly full of the homogeneous population of Iowa. Rhode Island does not have a homogeneous population, and we are not squares. We are a series of, islands and bay and, weird geography, rivers, and we have a very, we have a wonderfully diverse state. And so it becomes really tricky to do that. The geography by which they do that, and this is what the Census Bureau is going to give us, right? So all we got on Monday was how many people there were in the state. In September, they're going to give us very granular data about the state. We were supposed to get that in March, but the census was delayed because of the pandemic. So the number we got on Monday, we were supposed to get December 31st last year. And then the numbers we're going to get in September, we were supposed to have gotten in March. And it's going to be, there's a hierarchy of census geography with the smallest geography being the block, then block groups, and then tracts. You don't really need to know that in great detail, but it's interesting that the interesting data comes next time when we find out the demographics of the state and where people live. The process of manipulating this geography in the redistricting process, the pejorative term is gerrymandering. And it's because of this guy up in Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, and it's because of that district that looked kind of like a salamander that he drew in the early 19th century. The fun Rhode Island tie to this, at Rhode Island Hospital on the campus there, that old Gothic building is called Gerry House. That is his family. So he had relatives in Rhode Island, and their, I don't know if it was their mansion or whatever, or if they gave the building to the hospital there. And he still has relatives up in Marblehead. There are two ways to manipulate the data generally. One is along racial lines, and one is the other is along partisan lines. So racial gerrymandering, it can be done to disadvantage underrepresented groups. So for instance, in the South, historically, Black residents were manipulated through racial gerrymandering. So there are famous racial gerrymanders in Virginia, North Carolina, Texas, and so forth. The Voting Rights Act, which was a law passed in the mid-60s, has outlined a form of racial gerrymandering, and the federal courts will throw out maps that were drawn as unconstitutional racial gerrymanders. So you've heard a lot about, like, the Voting Rights Act was gutted by a case in 2013. The part that the courts rely on for throwing out maps for racial gerrymandering was not the part that was gutted in Shelby versus Holder. So something can still be done about racial gerrymandering. And in fact, there has been racial gerrymandering in Rhode Island. So the Senate district that connects Upper South Providence to Mount Hope on the east side and snakes along North Main Street through Providence, that district was gerrymandered as part of a settlement of a Voting Rights Act lawsuit. So the Voting Rights Act essentially says that a minority community has to, if possible, be able to have a district where they can, if they vote cohesively, elect someone of their community. And in the case of that district, in the Rhode Island State Senate, those neighborhoods are historically Black. I mean, going back to pre-colonial times in the case of Mount Hope. And they had divided those two neighborhoods, and there was a lawsuit in 2002. And as part of the settlement with the court, they reunited those two neighborhoods. And it was long represented by Senator Harold Metz, who was the only Black state senator, and now it's represented by Tiara Mack. So that's racial gerrymandering. There's this other type of gerrymandering, manipulating lines along party lines. Now in the South, there is an almost perfect correlation between race and party, right? So Black voters historically vote Democrat in recent decades. So that's called racially polarized voting. But nonetheless, there are instances where there's less polarized voting along racial lines, or they use race as cover for partisanship, and they draw districts solely to advantage one political party over another political party. And that is the most famous one I didn't put in the example there right now is Wisconsin, right? So in the Wisconsin General Assembly, if the Democrats were to get 60% of all the votes, they would get less than 50% of the seats, right? The Republicans, as the minority party in that state, have insulated themselves from popular control through elections, and that's partisan gerrymandering. There was a case that got to the Supreme Court called Common Cause v. Rucho in 2019, where we brought a claim. This was our North Carolina chapter. We brought a claim of partisan gerrymandering, and in a 5-4 decision, Roberts, writing for the majority, he said that the federal courts will not address partisan gerrymandering. It's a non-justiciable issue. They call them political questions. It's for the political branches of government. So how do you gerrymander? I kind of love this exercise. So imagine you have a population of, what is this, 50 people. And 40% of those people are red and 60% are blue. Well, if you're trying to sort of rig the system for the blue people, you could draw 5 districts where they control the majority. Or you could draw 3 districts where reds, who are the minority, control the 5-person legislature or 5-district legislature. So you can see there are different ways that drawing the boundaries differently that can be used. So you could substitute, obviously, partisanship here, but you could also substitute race, right? These terms are called packing and cracking. So the middle one, that is packing. This could be partisan or racial. So in the middle example there, what they've done, they've cracked the red population and scattered them among 5 districts so that reds can't elect anybody. And this historically was done in the South along racial lines. So you might have a county, say in Mississippi, that was 40% African American, and what they would do is put just enough in each district that they could never elect an African American in the district. Packing is what you see on the right, which is you pack the majority population into a few districts, so they control those districts, but they actually, the minority controls the majority of districts. This was done by Newt Gingrich. This is how Newt Gingrich rose to power. He recognized that if you cut up urban Atlanta, which was historically African-American, with the suburbs, which were white, you could put just enough Black voters in each district that they could never elect anybody. But if you created a couple 90, 95% Black districts, which was John Lewis's district, right? They could have their few Black members of Congress, and then the whites, who were largely Republican, would control all the other districts because there would not be enough Blacks in those districts to elect a Black congressperson. And Newt took advantage of the Voting Rights Act to do this. So this is sort of the building blocks. So here's an example. This is Austin, Texas. And this is an example of kind of what Gingrich was doing, which is the center of this, the bullseye, is downtown Austin. And as you can see, they drew a bunch of districts that, pulled just a little bit of downtown Austin out, but a lot of suburbs and rural areas, right? Okay, so when's this going to happen in Rhode Island? So last April 1st was Census Day, or April 1st, 2020. That's the snapshot of the population we got on Monday. That was how many people were living in Rhode Island on April 1st, 2020. Because if you remember, when you filled out your form, that's what it asked you. It said, who is in your household on April 1st? This, I didn't adjust it so you could see what happened. So December 31st, we were supposed to find out how many seats in Congress we got. But we didn't have that happen until late April. Then March 31st, we were supposed to get the redistricting file, which is that granular census block data that will be used to do redistricting. We're not going to get that file until September. It's September 30th is the latest that Secretary Raimondo said. Everything else, I think, is going to proceed at the same pace, which is essentially the General Assembly has to pass a law, and that's the next thing we'll talk about, that creates a process for drawing these districts. So the US Constitution puts the power to draw these districts in the hands of the state legislatures. Our state legislature chose to every 10 years just pass a law deciding how that will happen. That's got to happen this session. It probably will happen before June, but there's only 1 month before June. That's the month we're now in. So it's going to happen soon. And then that commission is going to meet starting probably in July and hold a bunch of public hearings. Well, based on the leadership bill that we'll talk about, that commission will deliver some districts to the legislature on January 15th of next year or before then. And then the legislature has to adopt maps. The power ultimately stops, the buck stops with the state legislature. Constitutionally, they possess the power to adopt the maps. Historically, they take what this commission gives them and they don't alter it, but they could alter whatever the commission gives them. Then as soon as the General Assembly passes their maps, it's a mad dash for municipalities. So some municipalities like Providence have wards or districts for their city councils or town councils that are geographically defined. Some are at large. Those that are at large have a lot less to do, but for Providence, which has 15 wards and a very diverse population, there's going to be a mad scramble to do this municipal boundary drawing. And then that has to be really done by May, because those have to be in place for the declaration period for people to run for election in the September primary. And that happens the third week in June of 2022. We are blessed in some ways to have this schedule. because I have opinions about this otherwise. In a normal year, it's very bad. We have the latest primary in the United States in mid-September. That has exactly one benefit. It gives us maximum time to do redistricting. The fact that the data aren't coming until September has pretty much stuck it to every other state in the union. Because every other state that has an earlier primary date, they're scrambling to get their maps enacted like right away. In fact, there are some states that have elections in 2021, and they'll have to do it with the old boundaries. So they're in a lot of trouble. So who does this? It's done by a commission. It used to be done by just a committee of the legislature. But starting in the 1990 cycle, the legislature delegated it to a commission. The last 3 times that commission has been 18-person commission composed of 12 legislators and 6 quote unquote public members. So I'm going to end that there. And then I'm going to try to bring up something else. So I'm going to try to share a different screen. All right, there we go. Oh, nope, that is not what I wanted to do. Sorry about that. I will try this one more time. That's my email inbox. That's not my email inbox. Okay. So the legislature, as I said, creates this 18-person commission with 6 public members, and then they hold hearings around the state. And that's authorized by a bill that the legislature passes. Typically, that bill is introduced by the Speaker of the House as this House sponsor, and the Senate President is the Senate sponsor. What I've been working on, and Terri, I mispronounce your last name every single time I try to say it. So with Representative Cortvriend.
Cortvriend.
Cortvriend. Oh, 2 vowels. That's a good way. Cortvriend.
Yes.
Okay. Is a bill that's basically an alternative to what the leadership does, right? It too creates an 18-member commission, but you can see here the language about that, but it shifts some power. So it shifts power away from the legislature, and it has more public members, and it makes those public members truly public.
John, we
Yes.
can't, are you trying to show us the bill?
Oh yeah, you can't see it?
No, all we
Oh,
see is redistricting. We see a big.
okay. Let me see. So you're seeing. Oh, I see. I have 2 monitors going. So let me unplug that monitor, and it should help me. Okay, thanks for your patience. Now are you seeing like, no. Okay, I will stop sharing and try to solve that as I talk. But so we have an alternative bill that would create an 18-person commission, but it would still have some legislators on it, but it would have more public members, and those public members would be subject to conflict of interest criteria. So what we've seen in the past is that the public members aren't really public. So 10 years ago, for instance, there was a lobbyist who was later revealed had loaned the then Speaker of the House, Gordon Fox, $10,000 and asked that he not repay the loan. There's another word for that. And there was the head of the West Warwick Democratic Committee. There was the head of the College Democrats. These were not random public people. These were people who were put on that commission to do the bidding of the then Speaker of the House, Gordon Fox. And so the bill that we have says you can't be a lobbyist, says you can't be a party official, says you can't be the relative of a public official, says you can't have run for public office in the last few years, and and it puts a bunch of conflict of interest criteria onto the public members. And it says that the majority of the public members have to be unaffiliated voters, because actually, the number of unaffiliated voters in the state is incredibly high compared to those who are particularly Republicans, but it's almost equal to the number of Democrats in the state. And then, so it creates a different kind of commission. And then it also creates a different process for the commission. So the leadership's proposal creates a process that is essentially a lot of public meetings, which is not a bad thing, but that's about the extent of the process. Our process has public meetings, but it does a couple of things with those public meetings. It says that that commission has to accept maps that are drawn by the public. And then it says that commission, if it draws maps, has to make the underlying data that lies beneath those maps, that's used to make those maps, public. And that's because now computers have gotten so advanced that if I can get the data file, I can upload it to my computer and go to a website, and I can do an instant analysis to see if it's a partisan gerrymander, right? Couldn't do that 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but we can do that now. So we want to get that data public. It says that before the final maps are recommended, there has to be kind of a cooling off period for the public to comment of a week. Because what often tends to happen is these commissions come out with some maps, people complain, they come out with a second set of maps, people complain, and then they come out with a final set of maps and they pass them right away before people have time to complain. And we create a cooling off period. And then the last thing is it puts a set of criteria in place that the commission has to abide by. So, every commission has to abide by that equal population. The Rhode Island state constitution says also that those districts have to be contiguous, meaning you can't have gaps of land. So you couldn't have a district that had a little bit of Burrillville and a little bit of Newport, right? And that the districts need to be compact, although that's an ambiguous term. But that's really what our Constitution says. Our proposed statute puts in a bunch of additional criteria, most importantly, that it has to obey the Voting Rights Act, and it has to respect communities of interest. And this is a term used in redistricting to mean a lot of different things. So for instance, in Portsmouth, it means common fence point, right? That is a cohesive community. In Providence, it's Olneyville, right? That's a cohesive community. It could also be, trying to think of another good example, like it could be a language enclave. So there might be a neighborhood in Providence where there are a lot of Liberian immigrants. And, that is a self-defined community of interest. And you shouldn't be dividing those things unnecessarily, those communities. And so those are the sorts of criteria that the commission would have to abide by. There are others, including compactness and so forth. And then finally, the commission couldn't consider or couldn't unduly I'm forgetting the exact phrase, couldn't unduly benefit one political party. So essentially can't put your thumb on the scale for one political party over another political party. And if you, thank you for putting it in the chat. And if you do any of these things, if this were to pass, that would be the grounds for a lawsuit. So almost all redistricting ends up in lawsuits. There were well over 200 lawsuits across the country last cycle. There have already been lawsuits filed this cycle in other states like Pennsylvania. A lot of this ends up in litigation. There have been lawsuits every cycle in Rhode Island since the 1960s, some of which have been very successful in the 2000 cycle, in the 90 cycle, and in the 80 cycle, there were successful suits in Rhode Island. And so you want to establish good criteria so that if they don't obey the criteria, you can sue, essentially, and say you didn't obey the criteria, and the courts have something to point back to. So let me see if I can try one more time to get what I want up, because I want to show you two things we've built. And it just got to type this real quick. That's like a long URL. Okay, here we go. Okay, so let me try to share my screen one more time. There we go. Now you see redistricting? Okay, don't make fun of my web page development skills here. So this is a page, and it's got to be prettied up here. But we actually, if you go to commoncause.org/Rhode-Island-redistricting, which we can put in the chat, you can click on this link. And we have a description of the bill, and it's a PDF. You could download it if you wanted to. And then we actually built a petition, which you could sign. Or excuse me, a letter campaign. So you could put your name, your last name, your email, your zip code. It needs the zip code to find out who your rep and senator are. And then if you do this, it will send that little message to your legislators, asking them to support the House and Senate version of the bill. So I'm going to stop share, but I will put that in the chat, that page. And you can use that if you would like to take some action on this issue. So I probably went like way over time, but I'm going to stop there and start answering questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
If the congressional bill HR1, if that were to pass, would that did I hear correctly that would mean that all across the country that we would have to have these nonpartisan commissions?
Yeah, so HR1 is this big bill. It's passed the House and it's sitting in limbo in the Senate because of the filibuster. They would make a whole host of changes to voting laws and ethics laws. And one of the provisions would require that all 50 states adopt what are referred to as independent redistricting commissions, modeled after the California Independent Redistricting Commission. And I actually got a question in the chat that was just directed at me, so you all can't see it, but somebody asked, is this a best practice of Common Cause? Actually, what Common Cause wants is we want to take legislators out of the process. So Common Cause believes that legislators, no disrespect meant to the legislators on this call, but it is a fundamental conflict of interest for people to pick their voters and decide like who gets to vote for them and who doesn't. And so we sort of invented an independent process for selecting people to be on a commission that would then have the authority to draw the maps, bypassing the legislature. And most notably, we did this in California, and they drew, far different maps than you would have seen if the legislature would have drawn them. For instance, they put several members of Congress in the same district, which did not make them very happy. In fact, Nancy Pelosi fought tooth and nail against our redistricting commission back in the 2000s. Even though ultimately Democrats seem to have benefited from the districts that were drawn. So, but to do that, you have to amend your state constitution, and that's too late for this cycle, right? So if we were to amend the state constitution, we wouldn't be able to do that until 2022, and this will all be over by 2022. So we're just trying to attack sort of the processes that exist now and highlight some of the flaws and make some additions and corrections to that. But ideally, we would want to have an independent commission. So HR1 and S1, its companion, would require independent commissions, but Congress only has jurisdiction over the federal elections. So those independent commissions would draw the districts for Congress, but state legislatures would still retain the right to draw their own districts. Now, that would affect Rhode Island because we still do have to draw those 2 congressional districts. And there is gerrymandering, even though we have 2 districts. In 2011, when they last did this, David Cicilline was coming up on his first reelection. And empirically, members of Congress are most vulnerable in their first reelection. Once they get past that hurdle, empirically, their chances of losing go down because the advantage of incumbency sort of takes over. And he was very, very close ally to Gordon Fox. And Fox, we needed to move, I think, like 3,000 people from CD2 to CD1 to balance the populations, and they moved like 40,000. And they took large parts of the west side of Providence, around Providence College, away from Jim Langevin's district and put them in David Cicilline's district. Those 2 guys acted like they were best friends this week. I can tell you their staffs were at those redistricting commission hearings and they were mad, like yelling at each other mad. But there is gerrymandering that occurs just for our 2 congressional districts because CD2 is more conservative than CD1. And so there's a desire by whoever holds CD2 to make it more liberal so they have a better or more democratic, so they have a better shot at re-election. So, the bills on the table, really there are two alternatives. There's our alternative and the leadership's bill. In the leadership's bill, which is, in all honesty, what's going to probably pass, there would be these 18 members, 12 would be legislators. I'm doing this off the top of my head, but I believe 8 of the 12 would be picked by the majority party, and 4 of the 12 would be picked by the minority party. So the speaker would pick 4, the Senate president would pick 4, the House minority leader, who's Blake Filippi, would pick 2, and the Senate minority leader, Dennis Algier, would pick 2. Those would be all be legislators, right? So you would have, yeah, those would be legislators. There would be 6 public members, I believe 3 picked by the speaker and 3 picked by the Senate president. And that's where we got into the lobbyists and the head of the town committees and stuff on those public members. Those 18 then meet regularly. They had 28 meetings last cycle. It was quite a slog, a lot of evenings for me. And they did it each of the 6 counties. So they did it before they came out with any maps. They went to each of the 6 counties. After they came out with the first set of maps, they went back to each of the 6 counties. Got a lot of feedback, new set of maps, back to the 6 counties. And they just kept kind of cycling through the 6 counties until they got a third set of maps. It's generally accepted, by the way, that there's kind of a détente where the Senate kind of gets to do its thing and the House does its thing, and the two of them don't mess in each other's business. And you can see, the Senate leadership will punish people, both Republicans and Democrats who didn't vote for the Senate leadership. And, the Speaker, the House leadership will punish both Republicans and those who didn't vote for the House leadership. So, for instance, in the 2010 cycle, there was a Representative Cale Keeble up in Burrillville. He had barely won, and they cut the Republican who had run against him in 2010. They cut his house, like just surgically cut his house out of the district and put it in another district. They called it the Keeblemander, and that was just to protect him. So there are all sorts of tricks that can be played. If you look on the West Bay, there's a district, I think it's Bridget Belverde. It runs from the northern end of East Greenwich to Point Judith to the lighthouse. It's 26 miles from top to bottom in a state that is 48 miles from top to bottom. And that was done to stick it to Senator Dawson Hodgson. Like they didn't like him, and so they stuck it to him. So they do it to both parties. It's just sort of like what leadership historically does. We'll see what this leadership team does. The House leadership seems to be far more, enjoy far broader support, is the way I would put it. So they kind of have fewer enemies to kind of play games with than we've seen in the last couple of cycles. In the 2000 cycle, there had just been a speaker fight and so there were a lot of dissidents. And then in the 2010, there had been a speaker turnover right before redistricting, and there were a bunch of people who weren't happy about that. But this leadership turnover in the House seems to have gone well. In the Senate, I wouldn't characterize it that way. There's a large group of dissident Dems, progressive Dems, who I think would anticipate, based on my conversations, that they're not going to have districts drawn nicely for them. One thing about the geography for everybody here, islands make it challenging. So there's kind of this historical trend of like you start from the speaker's district and you work your way out to the state, and you start from the Senate president's district and you work your way out from the state. So last time, Teresa Paiva-Weed was the Senate president. So like Newport was kind of the nucleus of the whole map for the state. But now it's North Providence and the northern end of Providence and North Providence. So it'll be interesting what happens. And if population shifts on Aquidneck, where do they adjust the lines? It's going to be a real challenge. Islands present a particular challenge for redistricting, particularly when you have like Aquidneck, where you have this big population center at the southern end of that island, right? Like depending on where the population shifted on Aquidneck, it's going to be a real challenge to kind of accommodate those and shift the lines. Does that make sense?
Sure does. John, I have a
Yeah.
question. So let's focus in on the operation. So like this 18-member commission actually sits down with a piece of paper and draws the lines, like, and they're given the numbers. How do the mechanics of the operation actually work?
Yeah, awesome question. I totally did not mention how it actually works, right? So the legislature hires a consultant. So in a lot of states, the legislature has like a staff that can do these things itself because they have map makers on staff. Rhode Island does not. Rhode Island does not have a robust bureaucracy in its legislature. It's actually something I think the legislature should have. So they farm it out to a consultant. And the contract every time goes to the same guy. His name is Kimball Brace. His firm is called Election Data Services of Fairfax, Virginia. He has been doing it since 1983. There was a state Supreme Court case in '83 that overturned the maps. And he came in to clean up the mess, and he's gotten the contract every time since. If you're a fan of The Daily Show on Comedy Central, they once did an interview with him, you know, one of those sort of, they're making fun of the person they're interviewing, and they called him the Picasso of gerrymandering. He is very good at his job, and his job is, and he does this in Illinois, in New Jersey, he's the guy for a number of states. His job is to listen to leadership and draw the maps as leadership wants them. So that the commission can be a little bit of a, like a facade, right? I think the commission can affect it at the margins, but it's really Brace taking some direction from the leadership. And I know I sound extremely cynical here, but this is a rather cynical subject. Brace is hearing from the leadership, you got to help this person, you got to stick it to this person. And Brace uses computers. So he flies between the states he works at, because they're all doing it at the same time. And he'll hire a guy who's a geographic information systems guy. And that guy's name is Ryan. And Ryan is going to be the guy on a computer, census block by census block, drawing the state on a computer. And then the commission gets to see the maps. The commission then gets to say, well, I wish you would do this and not do this. And, you know, they will make adjustments based on what the commission says, but the commission doesn't draw the maps. One last thing, when Kim started in 1983, he was drawing them on paper. Actually went into the case file for that lawsuit in '83. And sure enough, they had transparencies. Like that's how they were showing the districts were the cellophane transparencies, like when I was in school. And because they didn't have computers, they're drawing things by hand. Brace brought computers, but it was highly computationally intensive. This is a huge data file. And even 10 years ago, if you wanted to draw a map, you had to go into the State House, make an appointment with Brace. He would stand over your shoulder and watch you draw the map. And then you didn't get to keep the data file. He printed a PDF and you got to walk away with the PDF, but you didn't have the data underlying the PDF. To the question in the chat, now you can do that. So if you all go to, I'll put this in the chat. You can try this website. There are several websites you can try. And that's not a typo. It's district, the letter R.org. And if you try that website tonight, you can draw maps for the state of Rhode Island or the city of Providence. They uploaded the geography for Providence. That's the 2010 data. As I said, the 2020 data doesn't come until 2020 or till September. But once they have that up in September, you will be able to draw to the census block level maps that are of sufficient geographic granularity that they could be the official maps. And so what we want in our bill is we want the commission to have to take those maps, right? Instead of having Kim Brace standing over your shoulder and you're working at his computer, those maps, because he gives you an hour. You could spend weeks and weeks drawing very detailed maps using District R. And then there's a second website that I'll have you go to. It's called planscore.org. And this is why we want the data. If we get the data, you can upload it to PlanScore, and it calculates what are the odds that those maps were drawn without partisan bias. So you can evaluate the maps to determine, was it a partisan gerrymander or not, using a couple of different measures.
So they would have to share the maps in a digital format that people could go to a website such as that. They can't just show them on paper at a public meeting. That wouldn't do us any good, right?
Correct. So you need what's called a JSON file, and that's a file type like a doc, and that's it's a data file type, and Kim Brace, his system can immediately export a JSON file. Like, it's a click of a button for him. It's not a big deal, but we need to get them to make that JSON file public, and then we can upload them. You know, my hope is that, you know, the reform bill, you know, if they don't pass it, they at least take some of the good ideas in the reform bill, like requiring that they make that data public. And then if we're not successful, even with that, you know, we'll petition the commission. Like, they're not prohibited from making the data. They're just not required to make the data public. So we'll testify in front of the commission and say, we want you to make the data public. I've covered a lot of material. This is like,
That was very, very useful, John. Thank you very much. Even for me, it was very, very useful and clear.
Really helpful.
Okay, I'm glad.
Judy, do you have questions? You're on mute.
You're mute.
Unmute, Judy.
Yeah, with how a citizen can follow this. So even though so much of the data is public, could be public, it's also very complicated. I mean, you have to have a certain sophistication around data to be able to analyze what's going on.
Yeah, so I think we're going to bring two things to it, we being Common Cause. One is that we're going to hold trainings to teach people to use District R.
Oh, okay.
And those trainings aren't going to be, we're not going to say, draw all 75 house maps. Like, I love this stuff, and I've tried to draw 75 house maps, and I'm just like, oh, District 38, like, I don't know West Warwick, like, but I know, I recently moved, but I lived on the east side of Providence for 20 years. I know, like, where on the east side of Providence, you know, people kind of think of their neighborhood, right? Even though there are official neighborhoods in Providence, like Mount Hope and Blackstone and Olneyville, like, there are kind of unofficial neighborhoods. It's kind of like anywhere near this playground that's kind of a neighborhood. So we're going to encourage lots of people to draw their communities. And then if you kind of lay all those communities on top of each other, it creates a mosaic of the state, right? And if you get a lot of people, we're going to discover, you know, like, communities that we're kind of unaware of. So you're going to end up, you know, seeing maybe language communities or racial or ethnic communities that aren't appearing on any official map right now, but that hopefully then the commission will say, wow, we didn't realize there was this, again, like Liberian neighborhood in Providence. We better not like split that Liberian neighborhood in half, or more likely like Guatemalan or neighborhood or Dominican. And so we'll encourage the public mapping. And then on the backside, we'll demand the data file and make public how it scores. So
what do you say to a town? I know that there are people that live in Middletown, which is part of my district, but I know there are people in Middletown that are unhappy that they don't have a representative that lives in Middletown. They do have a senator that lives in Middletown, but I know that was kind of a sore spot for some people, some residents of Middletown. And we had 2 primary races, 2 Democratic primaries, myself and Rep. Ruggiero. And I think part of that came out of that, the fact that Middletown doesn't have their own rep. And Portsmouth, actually, we have 4 reps in Portsmouth. I think I have the biggest piece, but
wow.
Donovan and Jay Edwards, Michelle has the second biggest piece, but Susan Donovan and Jay Edwards both have little pieces of Portsmouth. And then Michelle's district jumps all the way over the Saconnet, and she's got Little Compton and a little piece of Tiverton. So when you think about the challenge of Aquidneck Island, what could you share with us?
Yeah, I mean, so
Can I just add to that? I'm sorry. Can I just add to that as well? I'm thinking about Lou De Palma, who has Middletown and Little Compton.
Right.
yeah.
He has to drive through Portsmouth and Tiverton to get to his Little Compton.
And then
district.
he has a tiny little bit of Newport too.
Yeah.
And that's because the courts recognize water as making something contiguous, right? So, but they historically say like that contiguity has to occur at a logical place. So for instance, Block Island is usually connected to where the ferry comes in, right? And if suddenly Block Island were connected to Westerly, you could probably get a court to throw that out. But maybe not, right? Because a lot of this is very, very subjective when you start connecting across water. So Jason Knight's district, which is parts of Barrington and Warren, they were trying to stick it to his predecessor, Jan Malik. And so like, if you look at the district on the Barrington River, it's kind of, it connects, but you have to take a canoe down the river to connect it, right? It's not the opposite sides of the river. Yeah, it's really hard once they've done these things to undo them, I guess is my thing. So you can look at the East Bay and you can see scores that were settled in 1990, right? So the speaker in 1990 wanted to settle some scores, and he settled scores, and those scores are still being, like, those reps are long gone, but their legacy still exists in those East Bay districts. And that's one trick, is just sort of, it's hard to undo the geography. And the 4 of you who live in Portsmouth aren't going to want to say, you know, which one of the 4 of you is going to say, I volunteer to, like, yeah, make Portsmouth whole.
Right.
But I volunteer to be the sacrificial lamb.
Well, 2 of the reps
Two of
don't
them don't
live
live
in
in
Portsmouth.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Only 2 of us live in Portsmouth,
Right.
Michelle and I.
Right.
So Jay lives in Tiverton and Susan lives in Bristol. So they could lose part of Portsmouth, and I don't think it would be, you know, it would not be hugely disruptive.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then-
especially for Donovan, who has a very small piece.
And another thing that makes it particularly complicated, that, and I'm a reformer, but sometimes reformers make mistakes. And in 1994, the people of Rhode Island, at Common Cause's behest, made a decision to downsize the legislature. And it took effect with the 2002 elections. And they downsized from a House of 100 and a Senate of 50 to a Senate or a House of 75 and a Senate of 38. And you don't have to be good at math to know that, 50 fits into 100 exactly 2 times, and 38 does not fit into 75 2 times. That was dumb. I don't know who made that decision, but it was a dumb decision, because you can't nest 2 House districts perfectly in a Senate district.
Which would really make sense.
Which would make it so much easier.
So we could have had 76 House districts.
Yes.
And that would have fixed that little piece.
Yep.
Yeah.
It was dumb.
Hard enough representing 2 towns that, but sharing it with 2 different senators too.
And it creates a real, I haven't talked at all about a real problem is the election geography are these precincts, right? And so if you create, if you lay House on Senate, then you lay town council on top, you might end up with what they call vestigial precincts, which are small little voting precincts. And they cost cities and towns a ton of money. So if you're familiar with Providence, but the old cathedral for the Episcopal Church on North Main Street, right at the bottom of Smith Street there, where Smith Street dead ends, there is a retirement home for Episcopal priests there. There are 11 Episcopal priests who live in that retirement home. They are an entire voting district. They have to open a polling place for those 11 Episcopal priests. One of them is a regular voter. And the voter record is a public record. So you can find out how he voted. Because all you have to do is look at the results for that precinct.
There's only one voter?
There's 11 potential voters and there's only one guy who votes.
Oh my God.
Sometimes more than one votes. And so what the Board of Elections has had to do is they combine, they report that with an adjacent precinct to protect that voter's anonymity.
Wow.
They won't tell you. And so this becomes a very challenging map drawing exercise. So it's not, reformers kind of make it sound like wave a magic wand and it's simple and it's, it's still complicated. You can reform it, but it's still like the physical act of drawing these districts is still a very complicated thing.
Without a doubt. Well, there's 1 million people, so, therein lies the challenge. So,
John, Mr. Grace testified in the hearing a few weeks ago, and he talked about, because the data, we were going to get the data so late, there was conversation about having the meetings early. So could you talk about, we don't even have the data yet. We can't start drawing maps. What are these meetings for? What would he be having meetings for without that information?
Yeah, so they did do 6 meetings, 1 in each county, before they came out with any maps last time. And I can tell you, as somebody who went to all 6 meetings, nobody came, and those who came had nothing to say. You really don't have a lot to say until, you might say, keep Portsmouth whole. But, so you might stand up at the microphone and say, I'm going to show you some flaws with the current maps. Try not to make these flaws with the new maps. What I'm hoping is we can use District-R to train people to, even though that's old data, it's 2010 data, you can still kind of define a community using 2010 data. So you could draw a map from 2010 that's Common Fence Point, right? It's not like Common Fence Point changed from 2010 to 2020. And you could go to the commission and say, keep Common Fence Point, don't divide it. But But Brace did mention maybe starting to draw maps using, it's called current population survey. So every year in between the census, the Bureau does a huge survey. You know, they survey not like 1,000 people, they survey like millions of people. So he talked about maybe using current population survey. We will stand up and scream. That is not the proper data to be using to draw districts. You should not use current population survey data under any circumstances to try to draw districts. It's not granular enough. And it's meaningless. It would be a meaningless exercise. So we should wait till September, but what the state should be doing is the state should be encouraging the state should be encouraging people to draw their own maps. So I got to ask, why would Common Cause not be asking to make House and Senate numbers make more sense? So we locked that into the state constitution, so that 75 and 38 for the House and the Senate are in the state constitution. So we would have to amend the state constitution to adjust that, and that the soonest that could be done is 2022, November 2022. So we're out of luck. But I think the state, it's the least sexy thing ever, but like we should fix that, you know, and make it go into effect in 2032, but we should fix that.
Has anybody put that in, John?
It's not a bill, it's a constitutional.
Yeah, but nobody's ever put it in.
So could you just put in a bill to fix that? Or would we have to have, the speaker did talk
Amend the
about.
Constitution. That's what you do. You put in a bill to amend the Constitution.
Oh, okay, yes, okay,
Yeah.
I have seen.
Probably
bills.
be a resolution, John, am I right, to put it on the ballot, or is it a?
Yeah, it's a joint resolution to put a question on the ballot, like the state name change was
Right.
last year. And then, but those resolutions can only be voted on at the next general election.
Right.
So,
And we've seen a whole host of potential changes to the Constitution get submitted this year. I've seen that one come across, so that's why I was wondering.
yeah.
That's true, because we have the vote, yeah.
Yeah, it's a little tiny thing that nobody really thinks about, but what chaos it creates.
This gets off topic just a little bit, but is it true that in 2022, we have to put it on the ballot to ask the people if we want to have a constitutional convention?
So in 2024, yeah, so Rhode Island's one of very few states that requires every 10 years. I think New York's every 20 years. Hawaii's every 10 years. That might be it. You have to have a question on the ballot that says, you know, do you want to have a constitutional convention? And that was put in the Constitution in 1973. And so the next time it was 84, and that 84 vote triggered the 1986 Constitutional Convention in Rhode Island, which was the last full constitutional convention of any state in the nation. It used to be, they happened all the time. I mean, Rhode Island had 3 in 10 years. I think 2 in the 60s and 1 in 1973. So 84, 94, it was defeated. 2004, it was defeated. 2014, it was defeated. So next is 2024. So Lenny has a question in the chat, John.
Mistake. I just want to know what happens if a population in a district grows?
Yep, that's a great question. So that's the reapportionment. So I think you joined after we started. So reapportionment happens first. So reapportionment means you have to balance the populations down to almost a single person so that all districts are equal in population to almost a single person. And so the criteria that this redistricting commission cannot avoid is whatever maps they come out with, those 75 districts have to be almost exactly equal in the number of people, and those 38 House districts have to be almost exactly. And so they will have to move lines in order to achieve that. So for instance, if Newport grew in population, then some Newport rep and some Newport senator is going to have their district contract in physical geography, because their district is now too large in terms of the number of people in it.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa, yes. So if Newport shrunk in population, their district would have to expand out into parts of Newport they don't currently have, or outside of Newport.
But you think the districts will start being drawn, as you mentioned, historically from Warwick this time?
So yeah, sort of historically, I'll tell you this. Senate President Dominic Ruggiero, I believe, has 5 polling places in his district, 3 in North Providence and 2 in Providence. Is that, how many is it, Lenny? You can, but he lost the Providence ones, right?
Do tell, Lenny.
Yeah.
He lost Providence, Fruit Hill, the high school, North Providence High School,
Oh,
the
he did.
elementary school, and the
Wow.
fire district. The only area he won was Woodville.
Okay. Well, I would bet that he's going to claim more parts that are more sympathetic to him, right?
He outside of Woodville, that's his only stronghold. All the rest of the area, I'll be honest with you, they couldn't, they did everything they could for me. He only won by 300 votes.
But yeah, I mean, I guess, but the larger point is,
I'm sorry.
no, it's okay. Yeah, and I'm glad you corrected me, because I'll probably be telling this story over the next couple months to try to convince people. But like, I thought he had won more than one precinct. So, you know, the precincts that were worse for him, he'll probably get rid of and try to find precincts that are better for him. That's historically what speakers have done.
Is a tie, like say like it was 2 of the areas were ties. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I won them, but it was only like by a small margin. It was like 1 or 2 votes.
Yeah, so you know, whatever it is, like they typically try to kind of shed the parts of their district that they don't run well in and incorporate other spots that they do run well in. So the counter example is there was a lawsuit in 2002, again, under the Voting Rights Act. Is complicated by the fact that the legislature was downsizing, but Joe Montalbano was the Senate president, and he gave up some of Lincoln, which was historically part of his district, and he lost next time. And he had to do that. I mean, it was rather magnanimous of him. They needed to settle the lawsuit. Somebody's geography had to move. He sacrificed some sympathetic parts of his district, and he lost. You know, and I think, you know, people recognize the lesson there, and they're going to try to protect their better turf that they run on. So, does that make sense?
Yeah, but doesn't it?
Makes absolute sense, John.
It makes really good sense, but doesn't it? If he was to shed Providence, he would he would go, I don't know, whatever.
But I mean, yeah, I guess a larger point is like, the people who control the process are going to try to draw districts that politically
help them.
help them. And what Kim Brace does is he's going to lay on top of this census data. So the census is going to deliver that file in my timeline, right? The PL file. And that doesn't contain like how those people voted. But Kim Brace has a file that tells you how every census block voted. And census block is very small geography. Like it's, it might be a couple dozen people. And he lays that on top and merges those files so that when he's drawing maps, he can say like, this block, super democratic, this block, not so democratic. And so it's a rush to get blocks into your district that are going to vote for you.
But that
Or your
doesn't
party.
really help. That doesn't help in a primary.
No, that doesn't help in a primary. No. Yeah. So
Would you also be able to lay in, so primary data from a previous election? Would that be something that Brace would roll into the analysis?
it could, yes.
Okay.
So this is like, Rhode Island's a little different because we're such a one-party state that a lot of this is party-on-party warfare versus Wisconsin, where they're like, the Republicans are trying to pack the Democrats into districts that are like 90% Democratic and then crack other areas. And so like Milwaukee, they're just packing Milwaukee all together because Milwaukee is overwhelmingly Democratic and giving them fewer reps and senators in Milwaukee. And then the suburbs, they're cracking the Democrats and spreading them among the suburban districts. You can do a little bit of that in Rhode Island, but it's harder, because there are so few Republicans, right? 12% of registered voters in Rhode Island are Republicans. So it's kind of hard to even manipulate it because partisan wise. So a lot more of it has to do with like local knowledge, right? I can show you the Providence City Council wards and tell you where a woman named Doris de los Santos lives. Why? Because there's a ward boundary that goes like this. It just goes, boop, boop. It's like that notch in southern Massachusetts that dips into Connecticut. That's Doris's house because she was threatening to run against a city councilor. And so they were like, yep, we're going to move her into a different ward. And there's a lot of that little stuff that's happening that my fancy plan score doesn't pick up, right? That's just like local Rhode Island political knowledge. But people see that. I won't see it because I don't run elections or campaigns. I've never looked at the van. Like, I don't know any of that stuff. But like when they try to protect Cal Keeble by cutting Don Fox out, Brian Newberry, Representative Newberry, then minority leader, he was like, look at what they did to Don Fox. And so the politicians recognize that. They start speaking out. If you watch the last round of redistricting, after they came out with the first cycle of maps, Charlene Lima, Representative Lima, got up there and I have this video and she just goes, Stephen Yuchi was the co-chair of the commission. And it was the greatest. Stephen Yuchi, I know what you're trying to do to me. And she just goes after him. And he's like, Charlene, calm down. And she's just like, you're trying to stick it to me, because they had hurt part of her district politically for her. And she knew that. She knew, if I lose this neighborhood here, it's going to hurt me politically. And they gave it back to her. Second round of maps, she didn't show up. Right. Same with Dawson Hodgson. You know, the first time they had him spanning the bay, you know, west to east from East Greenwich. They had him hopping over islands, you know, and then they took that away. They made him north to south, but at least it was land contiguous.
Wow.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Have fun. I mean, it's an interesting thing. The challenge this time is it's going to happen real fast, right? So, you know, Kim Brace is going to be telling the commission, like, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. And they'll try to cut the public out by hurrying up. And so we're going to have to react quickly and mobilize quickly. But we have the tools, right? We can draw the maps, we can evaluate the maps. We just need to get access to that stuff.
All right.
Thank you, John.
Wow.
Yeah,
Really very
pleasure.
It's
informative,
been very interesting.
very interesting.
And please don't leave me out.
Well,
Send
these
me
all
whatever you need me to do,
they'll all
because I know he's
publicly-
gonna try to cut me out.
they're all publicly noticed meetings. You can come and testify and comment on the maps and point out any anomalies in that district. So
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
Yeah.
John,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
I hope that was entertaining
I will-
and informative.
That's what it was.
Absolutely. I'm
In
gonna
that order.
Very
reclaim,
informative.
I'm gonna reclaim the host back, John, just so this
Yeah, that makes sense.
recording ends up on my computer, so we don't have to worry about that. But
Great.
Thank you, John.
Okay, have a good
thank
Yeah,
you,
night.
everyone.
thank you.
for joining.
Really helpful.
Have a
Thank you,
wonderful-
everybody.
Yes,
All
thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Terry.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.